Hello and welcome to the Chayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Hello and welcome, dear listeners. I'm Katarina Shomalyova, the head of Chayrion, and my dear guests today are Dr. Marek Čejka and Dr. Josef Kraus, both experts on Middle Eastern politics. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Today we will talk about Lebanon. What's going on in Lebanon? What is the situation in Lebanon? And what are some lessons to be learned from the situation? The first question is, due to the never-ending series of political and economic crises, Lebanon is occasionally mentioned as a failed state or as a country heading rapidly towards this title. Do you agree with such statements, Dr. Čejka?
I think it's a matter of perspective. Like calling that a failed state, it's not 100% correct, I would say. Of course, there are issues. There is a political deadlock. Obviously, there are many economical issues. And plus, of course, even the matter of security is a problematic thing. Like the state authority doesn't control fully the territory of the state, cannot fully penetrate and enforce the rule of law, which is one of the typical symbol or signal for the failed state or collapsed state. But still, anyway, the government somehow works. It provides the basic services. It is possible to enforce the law, at least at some levels, based on, let's say, the basic rules, not including the non-state armed actors, of course, like Hezbollah, Amal, and other militias. But in reality, this state somehow works. But there are so many issues. We might say economical issues, we might say blackout issues, energy supplies, and everything connected to each other, which really means it's a really unpleasant place to be, at least for the locals who are depending on the state budget or locals who don't have the income of a foreign currency, who are depending on the Lebanese pound. So the problems of the pound, I guess there is going to be a chance to speak about it in more details. But frankly speaking, it's not a pleasant place to be, but it's not a failed state, according to my opinion.
Agree. There is some measurement of the political fragility of state. It's called the Fragile States Index, which is done by the American think tank Fund for Peace. And currently, Lebanon is on the 23rd place out of the 180 states. So it's really very unstable, but it's still not the failed state. It's quite close to it. It's also, now the situation is worsening, the criterias, but I don't think it's still possible to call it a failed state.
Do you think Lebanon is heading towards becoming a failed state? Or is there hope of fixing these issues?
There are many contexts. Of course, for example, current Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is also accompanied by the escalation of the situation on the Israeli-Lebanese border. It could be a problem if there will be some huge escalation. Of course, it will not be good for the Lebanon as a whole, for its economy, society, and so on. But still, I don't think there is a danger of such an escalation. Definitely, the situation is serious. But on the other hand, we have also some internal political complications. For example, there is for quite long time, there is not president in office. And it's also complicating a lot of political procedures in Lebanese politics. But if there will be some compromise and the president finally will be appointed, I think this could a little bit help the internal political situation and economics.
I would say it's on the way to the failure, but it doesn't mean it has to reach the end after all. So it really depends on the regional situation. It depends on the itself political deadlock inside of the country. As Marek Čejka told me or said, there is this problem with the presidential position. There are technically two political blocks. We might call it the pro-Western bloc and pro-Eastern bloc. It doesn't mean the orientation over the America or Russia, but it means the orientation towards Syria and Iran on one side, or the orientation to France, West in general on the other. So, and these two blocks are somehow balanced, and there is a huge power struggle between those two, affecting the situation about the presidential elections. There's been 12 rounds so far of the presidential elections, but no success. And obviously, there is no candidate that would fit and that would be acceptable for both sides, both blocks. So that is the main challenging issue. And of course, if it lasts for a long time, it could really paralyze the country. And if the politics and the state administration might be paralyzed, of course, it affects the economy and it really threatens with the economic collapse. That would be really something like a state failure in this case.
My next question concerns the infamous massive explosion in the port of Beirut in August 2020, which caused over 200 deaths and roughly $15 billion in property damage. This was often cited as the final blow to the rapidly ailing economy of Lebanon. However, the country is still somehow functioning. What is your opinion on the issue, Dr. Čejka?
Yeah, definitely. That was some very huge blow to the Lebanese economy. And also the whole world could see how this state works and the failures of these states. But on the other hand, it's definitely the only problem of Lebanon. On the other hand, for example, there is some parallel economy which little bit helps the ordinary people. But generally, yes, it's possible to say that the whole economical situation of the ordinary people is very critical.
Dr. Kraus?
It really was a huge blow. Like, let's say, frankly, there are just few gates open for the international business in Lebanon, since the country is somehow surrounded by not friendly states, neighboring Israel, which is totally the enemy of Lebanon, and neighboring Syria, which is, not friendly state, let's call it this way. So it's very difficult to make any business on land or through the lands and routes. So obviously, the remaining gates are the air and, of course, the sea. And now the gate through the sea is somehow not closed totally, but a lot of paralyzed since the blow at the Beirut port. So that is really the issue. And we might follow that on the economic indicators of the country. I mean, from the macroeconomic perspective, there's been a huge inflation rate reaching 3 digits. Like for 22, I think it was more than 200% of the inflation, which is really a disaster. Devaluation or depreciation of the Lebanese currency or the Lebanese pound. Of course, everything is super expensive. You buy it abroad and you have to pay in dollars or euros, and you don't have dollars and euros in your pocket since your assets in the banks were frozen down to prevent the banking system from collapse. So it's really unpleasant situation for the locals who are demanding or depending on their bank accounts that are really in reality frozen. There is nothing you can do about it. And it's very difficult to make any sort of business in such an environment. So that limits a lot. And since the Port of Beirut explosion, I think the situation is getting worse and worse every year.
What consequences did the explosion have in the broader region beyond Lebanon's borders in terms of economy, politics, and security, Dr. Kraus?
Well, Lebanon has been always the gate from the Middle East, or let's say, better say, Levant, to the West. It's been a place connecting the West and the East from the perspective of business. For the last decades, it's been step by step replaced by United Arab Emirates and places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and others. But still, Beirut remained the important gate from the East to the West and vice versa. But right now, the gate is almost closed down. That is, of course, challenging thing, not only for Lebanese citizens, but also for the people from surrounding countries, such as Syria and even Jordanian Kingdom. And of course, the almost collapse of the banking system affects the business in the Middle East in general. Like for decades, the Lebanese banking system has been the essential part of the banking system and financial activities of the Middle East. And now it's done. It's almost about to collapse. It affects, of course, the money flow. And if there is no flow of money, so how can you do the business? So it's very difficult even for the people from the neighboring country to deal with such a situation.
Dr. Čejka?
Despite the very critical situation of Lebanon, I also mentioned this some kind informal or parallel economy, which is a little bit easing the situation of Lebanese people. There is also the very huge Lebanese and very, very influential Lebanese diaspora, very economically powerful, which is also a little bit easing the situation because there is sometimes strong support of some segments of Lebanese society. And there is also some international assistance, which is helping partly the Lebanese economy in current dire situation.
According to the World Bank, Lebanon is the country with the highest number of refugees per capita, with circa 1 refugee per every 4 nationals, which is a very high number. While there have been traditionally significant numbers of Palestinian refugees and Syrian migrant workers present in the country, the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 and the massive influx of refugees to the country. What impact did these events have on the political, economic, and social situation in the country? Dr. Kraus?
I would say a huge impact. If we speak about politics, this is the issue that some parties trying to use for their political campaign and their political gain. It's really a matter of political competition. How to deal with the refugees here? There are like roughly 2 million Syrians, maybe, who knows? There are not clear numbers, and not all of those refugees are really registered. So even the state of Lebanon doesn't know exactly. So there's the World Bank. So how to deal with these people and how to deal with 500,000 Palestinian refugees remaining in the country for maybe 3 generations. That's a really huge, challenging thing. And of course, there are political powers managing this topic in their own favor, saying, okay, we need to deal with this expansive and annoying issue, how we should settle down the proper relations with Bashar Assad. And then we have to speak with him about the repatriation of the refugees. On the other side, there is another bloc saying, okay, we will never negotiate with Bashar Assad. According to our perspective, Bashar Assad is a war criminal. And from the perspective of ethic and morality, we definitely cannot solve the issue of Syrian refugees by dealing with Bashar Assad. So that's the political topic, and it really affects even the political campaigning in the country. It's really relevant for Lebanese citizens to vote pro or against the repatriation of the Syrian refugees. And then, of course, the economical impact. It costs a lot. It really costs a lot. And Lebanese is they're alone in this a lot. Like what Dr. Čejka said before, from time to time, they are able to reach for the international funding in helping and things. But the money flow is really limited. Why? Because many organizations like EU are they do have conditions for sending money to Lebanon. And one of the conditions is keep Hezbollah, which is considered a terrorist organization, away from the government. But you cannot keep Hezbollah out of the government since it's such a relevant political force. So there is no way out of this. It's like a dead circle. So you cannot keep Hezbollah out of the government. You have to negotiate with Hezbollah. You need to let Hezbollah to participate on the power, the state power somehow. But in the same time, for this purpose, you cannot reach the international help and funding to manage your economy and manage things about refugees. So this is really the deadlock around it, and it has its very depressive economic impact. Everything costs a lot, and even the refugees themselves, they are in a very sticky situation, I would say. They have empty pockets. They have to beggar a lot on the streets of Beirut, which means even the rise of criminality, naturally. So that's in reality and de facto caused the tension between the locals, meaning Lebanese people, and refugees. It's just a matter of time before there would be any sort of eruption of violence between those two groups. There is a high risk of it.
Dr. Čejka?
This was very comprehensive evaluation. The only thing which I will add, that when the war in Syria started in 2011, if I remember well, there was an assumption of political analysts that very soon the Syrian war, the civil war, and all the things around it will flow into Lebanon. But it didn't happen. So it also showed some strength of these states. Maybe it's still some memory of the cruel civil war. Many people still directly remembers the atrocities of this war. So maybe also this historical experience helped a little bit and is helping the Lebanese society. It's protecting it a little bit against the dangerous escalation of various conflicts.
So you're basically saying that the Syrian civil war also greatly exhausted the Lebanese state.
I would say a lot, of course. At least with this refugee flow, it really costs a lot to state or the national budgets. Someone has to take care of the people here. And obviously, it's not the monetary fund, it's not the World Bank, it's really the taxpayer, the Lebanese one. So it really costs. And of course, this budget and this money are missing somewhere else. You might develop the infrastructure for those. You might pay for the energy, and then you won't suffer the blackouts that are quite common in Beirut and other places in Lebanon. So logically, this is the other source of the tension between locals and the foreigners in general, I would say, refugees. Doesn't matter if they are from Palestine or they are from Syria.
Another important source of tension within the Lebanese society is its demographics, which have changed drastically since the last census conducted in 1932, if I'm not mistaken. Political power in the country is shared among the Sunni, the Shia, and the Christian Maronite communities, according to their population as presented in this census nearly a century ago. However, they do absolutely not reflect the present day ratios. To what extent is this a problem and what could be a solution?
Of course, there was a very huge development of Lebanese society since the last census from the beginning of 30s. And I think it was also partly one of the reasons for the civil war, because for example, huge parts of the Lebanese society were dissatisfied with the political system, how they are represented. And so, of course, it was much more complex. It was not the only reason. And I think there was also the solution of the civil war, the so-called Taif agreements. They also were counting with some reforms of Lebanese political system due to the very specific form of confessionalism. So, and also, of course, there is still development. It's developing the proportions of the communities in Lebanon, but there is no, I think, still exact number. And yes, definitely, this confessionalism and disproportion and feeling of disproportion, especially, for example, by Shia communities, which were usually the poorest part of the Lebanese society, could be also the reason for political instability.
Dr. Kraus?
Let's explain maybe the context and how the system works. If we look at the numbers, not the clear numbers, but the estimation, there are basically three entities in Lebanon. There are Christians, there are Sunnis, and there are Shiites. If you look at the estimation before the war, I mean the early 70s of the 20th century, we might say, roughly 60% of the population might be Christians, 30% might be Sunnis, 10% Shiites. Right now, the estimation speaks about, roughly 40% of the population might be Christians, I guess even less. And then from the remaining 60%, 30% might be Sunnis, and 30% might be Shiites. So roughly saying 1/3 of the country population is constituted by Christians, 1/3 by Sunnis, 1/3 roughly by Shiites. And we do have a system based on the Taif agreement with the power distribution, which means that the most powerful position in the power system or the state system holds the Christian president. And the president has to be always from the Christian entity, while Sunnis are holding the second powerful position in the country, which is the prime minister. So the prime minister has to be always Sunni. So what remains for Shiites? That time, I mean the early 90s, that time the weakest entity within the Lebanese society. They hold the power by the Speaker of the Parliament. It doesn't mean a thing. But right now, the numbers are like almost equal. And Shiites are represented by the most powerful non-state armed actor in the whole Levant, I would say in the whole Middle East, and that's Hezbollah. So they are trying to reach the power, of course, on the expense of Sunnis and Christians. And these two entities are naturally trying to prevent them to do so. So this is the source of the bloc, which really stick to the Lebanese politics. Like one entity is trying to reach more power on the expense of these two remaining entities. And of course, those two entities are trying to prevent the first one to really reach the power. So without any redistribution of the competitions or the power itself, this deadlock within the Lebanese politics would continue. I'm pretty sure that would continue. But there is no will of other entities to really settle down the new game rules, I would call it. Like you would need to say, we are losing the power. Let Shiites do the governance of the country. And nobody wants that, I mean, from Sunni and Christian perspective. So this is really, really difficult situation. And of course, there is the need in reality for Taif agreements and the system to be changed or modified at least. But I'm very skeptical about reality behind.
So you don't believe there is actually going to be a significant change in the distribution of political power in Lebanon?
Without violence? No, I don't think so.
Maybe one more addition.
Sure.
There is also like the fourth player, the Druze community, which is like a little bit more than 5% of Lebanese inhabitants. And also they played sometimes, for example, during the civil war, very important role in the Lebanese politics. They were like more allied with the Sunni and Shia groups against the Christian phalangists. Definitely, they are also like some quite still important political factor in Lebanese politics.
As we have discussed in one of our previous podcasts, Hezbollah plays a major role in contemporary Lebanon. Could we go as far as stating that it currently dominates the political scene? And why and how did it gain such a significant role as it has right now?
Well, I would say Hezbollah is not just a political party, it's really a movement. A movement having its own military wing, social wing, infrastructure wing. So there is a lot of things behind. Besides the political party, which is one of the largest in the country, right now they're holding like 15 MP seats. So it's really one of the biggest one. So besides that, there are a lot of projects of building up the infrastructure, especially those territories that are inhabited by Shiites, naturally, like the Bekaa Valley and the south of Lebanon, south of the country. Plus, there are social projects behind. They're building up the schools, hospitals, mosques, naturally, and a lot of that for Iranian money and the money from the fundraising and the money from the expats, I mean, the community outside of the state of Lebanon. So they do provide services for the locals, and that's the source of their popular support. So that really means this is a strong political and social movement and party. And plus, being heavily armed by Iran again, it really makes them the strongest non-state armed actor in the whole Middle East, I would say. They might compete with Shia militias in Iraq or Houthis in Yemen. We cannot compare, actually. But still, at least in Levant, they are definitely the strongest, which is quite challenging for the state authority.
Yeah, definitely. This heavily armed group, it makes them very specific in Lebanese political milieu because they didn't disarm after the civil war, which is also different from the other groups. So, of course, they are not overlord of the Lebanese politics, but they play very specific roles. Sometimes they can be considered to be some kind of like state within state or something like that.
This is exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you. My last big question for G concerns the business and economy of Lebanon. Neighboring Syria seems to be taking steps to start recovering from devastating economic consequences of the more than decade-long armed conflict. It re-entered the Arab League, and the Assad regime is attempting to open up towards the rest of the world. Given the very relative stability in economically crucial regions of the country, a number of Western companies are considering entering or re-entering the Syrian market. Can this also be said about Lebanon? Is present-day Lebanon a place where a Western businessman should consider making investments? Dr. Kraus.
I'm a bit skeptical about that. If you follow really the macroeconomic data from the last years, there is a clear trend. It's going to be worse and worse. Maybe Lebanon just reached the bottom and now it might rise again. It might really happen, but it really matters what's the situation there and how stable the country is. Whether or not it can provide a safe environment for the investors or not. If there would be a risk of civil war, of course, nobody would invest in this country and in the region. If there would be a risk of the state collapse, of course, nobody would risk an investment in such a place. If there is such instability based on economy, high inflation rate, high depreciation of the Lebanese pound, even the energy problems, it really matters. Like, if you got electricity for just a few hours a day, of course, how can you make a business or at some places? How can you invest into industry or building up the industry or infrastructure? Everything is related to the energy, of course. And if you suffer the lack of energy, so you cannot do anything in the country. And I think right now Syria is offering better environments for this post-conflict reconstruction. There would be plenty of money flowing into reconstructing the country. And that's the advantage for those who are considering entering the Syrian market. But right now, if you look at the numbers, the foreign investments are actually flowing out from Lebanon. So that is the trend. So if it might continue in a year or two, and then the situation might be stable again, okay, I'm optimistic about regaining the support from the foreign investment. And plus, of course, the Lebanese community from abroad might help a lot. But they have to believe it's really the investment that might be, bringing the gain. If it's the investment where you just risk losing it for the civil war or the state collapse, it would never happen.
Yeah, I think maybe we can repeat that they are like the two very important factors. The one is the internal political, the issues with the president and with the stability of the government. If it will be resolved, it can really help also the Lebanese economy and hold the stability and the possibilities for foreign investments and so on. And the other thing is the possible escalation of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah movement. If it will stay in this situation like it, some border skirmishes, rocket firing and so on, which will not be similar, for example, like the Israeli invasion in the 1982 or 2006 operation, then it also can be like more positive for Lebanese situation as a whole. But if there will be some very serious escalation, which is still some kind of possibility, even it's not so probable, then it would be very harmful for any foreign investments and Lebanese economy.
A great point I would even add, or maybe develop that one. It's connected to the infrastructure. Like, okay, we spoke about the port of Beirut being destructed. And what's the remaining gate to the country? It's not the sea, it's not the land, it's the air. So if there would be skirmishes that might have a higher escalation between the Hezbollah forces and the Israeli forces, I'm not speaking about the Lebanese army being included in it. Still, the Israeli Air Force might really destroy the remaining facilities for any sort of international connection and business. I mean, the airport at Beirut. And even these days, quite often, the Israeli Air Force is demonstrating its strength in the Lebanese airspace. Quite often, you might hear in the city of Beirut, they call it the sonic bombs. Like you're in the fighter jet and you just break the speed of sound, so it makes the sound and the shock wave. So they do that on purpose just to show off the strength, and they're powerful. So nobody doubts that it would be any sort of clashes. Israelis would destroy the Beiruti airport quite easy, and then it's done. That's game over really for the international business.
Personally, I remember when I was for the first time in Lebanon, it was in year 2007. So it was 1 year after the conflict with Israel. Of course, it was not such a serious like the invasion beginning of the 80s, but still it was such a visible, like the destruction. For example, the huge highway bridges, they were still damaged. Some Shia neighborhoods in Beirut, which were ruled by Hezbollah, they were also almost completely destroyed. So really this something like that will repeat. It can be really very serious for next development of Lebanese economy.
These are not very positive outlooks, I would say. Do you think there is a realistic chance for any kind of normalization of Lebanese ties with Israel?
Well, there are so many factors that might influence it, and I cannot read all of those. Of course, there is always a chance, especially if the international community intervene. But since the war in Gaza shows off that Israel is not taking care of the international community whatsoever, so why should he care about the situation between Lebanon and Israel? Still, Israel considered not Lebanon as an enemy, but logically Hezbollah as the enemy. So it's obviously willing to do the airstrikes or do even the military invasion to the Lebanese territory. That would definitely escalate the situation in the whole Middle East. And in that case, we might expect the intervenience from abroad as well. I mean, not only the West, but mainly also the East, Syria, Iran, Shia militia in Iraq, and that might be a really huge mess. Maybe by preventing that happen, that might be the motive for détente politics between Lebanon and Israel. But the constellation must be very good. I mean, it really needs stabilized Lebanese politics. It needs friendly governments in Israel, meaning not the right nationalists / extremists in the government, but mainly left-oriented parties in it, willing to find a compromise. And then, with the help of the international community, it might finally happen, but I'm very skeptical. I really think the chances are quite low.
Yes, definitely, I agree. There is such a polarization, and also the Israeli government with Benjamin Netanyahu and his extreme ministers, or many of them at least. And on the other hand, now very radicalized Hezbollah movement. This is not a good environment for any agreement. This is also interesting to remember, for example, in 80s or 70s, when the Israelis were much more pragmatic, and they were doing some allies inside Lebanese politics, especially with some Maronite Christians and Maronite Christian politicians. They were even like personal meetings between them, but nothing like that exists today. Yeah, so we can also see this very visible change of the quality, I think especially the war of 2006 is also very polarized. Even some parts of the Lebanese society, which can be much more, for example, open to the peace with Israel, they finally polarize it against it.
I would say this is a really good point. Actually, the existence and the policies of the state of Israel paradoxically unites the Lebanese citizens in this. Even from the entities of Christians or Sunnis, they are actually hating Hezbollah for what's doing in its own country. They do respect Hezbollah for the only power resisting the state of Israel, which is considered being the enemy, even for the Christians in Lebanon, because they just have a very bad history, the common history. So the existence of Israel unites the Lebanese nation, even in support for Hezbollah as the main protector against the Israeli aggression. That's their perspective, really. I've heard that many times.
Yeah, I also remember there was this very controversial so-called South Lebanese army, which was like a Lebanese, some militia, but not supporting Lebanese government, but it was supported in the southern part of Lebanon, in the occupied part, or in the part under influence of Israel for Israeli interests. And it consisted of sometimes some Shia soldiers and officers, but also some Christians. So this was also some kind of proof what was like the Israeli politics of divide and rule in southern Lebanon. After the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from South Lebanon, the final was in 2000 during the government of Ehud Barak. Most of those Lebanese soldiers from the South Lebanese army, they escaped to Israel because they were very afraid of some repercussions from the Hezbollah movement. And I think one of the leaders, I think it was one general, even like established some falafel restaurant in Tel Aviv.
Okay. Thank you very much for all your insights. This has been even though very pessimistic, but still informative podcast. And I'm looking forward to all our future podcasts together. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Chayrion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at chayrion.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.